So I'm Dave Dykstra. I am kind of the lead developer at the moment of Fermi, of Apptainer. It's just kind of turned out that way. And because especially after well, I will talk a little bit about the history. Yeah, I'm at Fermilab, and so our background is with high throughput computing more than with high performance computing. So just a brief history. I'm mostly talking about what's happening recently, but so you know, as you all know, it's the new name for Singularity, and Singularity was originally written in 2015 at LBNL by Greg Kurtzer, and there were lots and lots of community contributions at that point. And this predated the unprivileged user namespaces, so although it was already added even in Singularity 2 when it arrived in RHEL 7 as an option. So it had to be it already had to be in setuid root in the early days in order to be able to take advantage of all the Linux features. So, but in our community, the high throughput computing community, we already started using non-setuid root mode with Singularity 2. Because that was really important for us when we run on lots of computers all over the place, and we can't expect to have the tool installed. We did get everybody to install it, but the unprivileged was super important. But then in 2017, Greg founded Scilabs, and its whole purpose was to develop and support Singularity. And at that point, it was rewritten in Go. And but then a few years later, Greg left Scilabs, and he was able to maintain leadership of the Singularity open source project. And some of the core developers came with him to the new company. And then at that point, then it was hosted under a new community organization that he founded at the same time. It was called HPC Next Generation. And then a year later, Scilabs, which was still developing the project, they left. They created their own fork. They called it Singularity CE. So there was all kinds of confusion over that. And 6 months later, our project joined the Linux Foundation, and they say, you got to change the name because we can't trademark it. And so that's when the name Apptainer was chosen. And Greg was then instead of just being the benevolent dictator, he was one of 5 people on the technical steering committee. I also joined the committee at that time. So then in March of 2022 is when the first Apptainer release was. It was basically just the same thing with a name change. We had to remove a few things. But then 6 months later was the rootless by default, the unprivileged by default without the setuid root. And then 9 months later was the next one. So I'm just going to briefly talk about these things aren't all that recent unless people think of only Singularity. They're more recent than that. The setuid root portion of Apptainer was moved out to a separate package, and that not installed by default, since by that point there was much more functionality that was enabled to be rootless. Enough it was enabled, and I did a lot of that. Led that effort to make it rootless, as that was so important to our community, and I wanted to extend it to more of the default. So fuse mounts were supported for everything, and also it was especially important the squash fuse program for that interpreted the main core file system in the Singularity image format files, and it was shown to be in parallel when you have lots and lots of file accesses and a bunch of cores. it was shown to be very similar in performance to the kernel Squash FS, in some ways even faster. So then at that time also the fake root mode was added, which was based on unprivileged. I should probably just exit Zoom here. So that was important, especially for building containers, because you need to think when you're building containers from scratch that they usually, you need to install all their packages and things like that, and a lot of them assume a lot of root accesses. So yeah, there previously was a fake root mode that used the etc sub-UID and etc sub-GID mapping, and that which is also used by like Podman, for example. And but that requires system administrators to set up. A lot of systems didn't have that, so we had
recording in progress.
Totally unprivileged mode, and also the it implies the fake root option by default. If an unprivileged user tries to do a build, it'll just use that mode. Also at that time, then a script was added to install Apptainer unprivileged, so you don't even need your system administrator's involvement at all if you want to try to run it on a system. And it just uses the pre-built binaries from RPMs and installs it into your own home directory. Also added support for the nesting of Apptainer commands, so you can run Apptainer inside Apptainer, and also then in 1.2 was the unprivileged encryption of zip files for those who want that. And also another important feature at that time was can template the definition files and use them for multiple purposes that way. Okay, I guess I'm not selected the right app. There we go. So in Apptainer 1.3, which was last year, that was then we just made fuse mounts used by default even in set-UID mode, and this was for those who are still using set-UID root mode. There are some features that only work that way, but this addresses a security vulnerability where all along it was known from the early days. People said, "Hey, isn't this a security risk to have to allow users access to the raw data that's being interpreted by the kernel file system?" And their kernel developers are saying that's we haven't made those file systems robust enough for anybody to have raw access. These things assume that the data has not been changed underneath users. Is possible to modify the contents of the raw file system while it's running, and even in early version in 1.1.8 we had disabled the use of the ext3 file system, especially. This is not everybody uses that, but there's sometimes we have that option to be able to mount an ext3 file system, and that is especially shown to have vulnerabilities if you allow raw access to the. So we turned that off in 1.1.8, so then in 1.3 you're able to turn that back on because we're using fuse mounts even in set-UID mode, and that takes advantage of a not very widely known feature in Fuse 3 to have it first be pre-mounted before you invoke the library. So also in 1.3 we added all the 4 Fuse dependencies were built into the package, so that people didn't have to have those dependencies installed, and also because we wanted to have recent versions of all of them. A lot of times the people had too old versions and it was causing issues. And then also changed the default went in user namespace mode to go ahead to use overlay FS, either from the kernel or from the Fuse overlay FS. And instead of this underlay option for adding bind mount points, so I don't know how many of you are familiar with underlay. I had kind of an emotional attachment to it because it's what enabled us in the HTC community to go unprivileged early. Because it's for whenever you bring in bind mounts, there needs to be a bind mount point in order for bind mounts to work, there has to be like a directory there or a file there for in order a bind mount to happen. And a lot of times those weren't already there in the containers, so we have to add those in somehow. And the original implementation, and again, we switched to it after 1.3, was to always use overlayFS for that. So even though you weren't doing anything else, we needed the overlayFS just for bind mount points. And the underlay option avoided all that by having it mount the, it created a mount namespace and first created all your extra bind mount points, and then bind mounts everything else in from the original container that wasn't being hidden by it. So we didn't need overlayFS, but it was complicated, and it was difficult to maintain, and by this time overlayFS was much more widely available. We didn't in the early days when we needed underlay, overlayFS was only a privilege. We couldn't even use it inside user namespaces. That was so why we needed the underlay for this transition time. So there was also in 1.3 the new registry and key server commands that they were separate from the remote command, and added an AppArmor profile for user namespaces in Ubuntu 24. So what that is Ubuntu 24 they decided to block user namespaces by default, and unless you had this extra profile saying this program is allowed to use them. So I think they made a mistake in that, and that you should. I usually recommend people to just turn that off. It's just the default, but for those who don't turn it off, we wanted to make it easy by having that profile. Okay. So now this is very recent. We just released Apptainer 1.4 a month or two ago. So this is what I'm starting to get into more detail on what happened then. So here we added libsubid support. So this is for when you are using etc subuid, subgid mapping. A lot of system administrators want to be able to just update it centrally instead of having to update all the nodes. So that is available in there, although it's a bug's been reported in it. I think there's going to be an update to it in 1.4.1. And we added control of the squashing of CIF files so that it uses make squash FS, and there's all kinds of options in there. You can use different compression options, different speeds, so people were asking for multiple different, adding different options. They said, well, I'll just let you pass in all any option you want to make squash FS. And also added the bundling of that make squash FS to the package that time in order to get the most recent version, which enabled us to have the progress bar, because sometimes it could take a really long time, and people saying, what's going on? This is when you're doing your build of the container. Added the ability also to bind in the configuration files. The GPU, it used to be, it would only be libraries that would be coming in from the host. NVIDIA Container Toolkit was also including a config file, so this enabled us to add that configuration file. And with ROCm, so this is, I guess, the AMD GPU. It turned out that it didn't work quite like the NVIDIA containers. Really, all it needed was like device drivers to be coming in, and not libraries. So we ended up removing a lot of the libraries that were in there. People are saying that they were actually causing more harm than good. So. And just simple definition file in the Bootstrap. If there was one called Yum, which enabled you to like build a container from an operating system from scratch, just reading, and instead of starting from another container, you could just pull in all the packages and just added a DNF since Yum is deprecated. And also just added the ability to pull with the pull command. There already was with the build command. You could build a sandbox which is unpacked rather than in a CIF file. So there's just someone wanted that also with the pull command when you're pulling it straight from a container or from a registry. And another little small thing that may be noticeable when you're doing a PS, then it just shows up in the what the name of the image file is being run inside in the process PS list. And now 141 is in the works, should be released soon. And just mostly bug fixes, right? Fixing when a user lookup was, it was preventing instances from starting if your system has win bind. So that's been fixed. And someone also just the GoCryptFS was the bundled GoCryptFS package was assuming a newer CPU than what the host operating system was, and so it wouldn't work on older systems. And had if someone tries to use some of the really the network options are mostly all privileged, that they require setuid root installation. It wasn't very clear if someone tried to use it. So now we just made it so that it's more obvious that that's what's missing. And also OCI archive files. I don't know how many of you were here this morning, but Anders was talking about the nerdctl is another alternative to Podman, really. And for people who are using that, it didn't work for the importing those. And likewise, but Docker, the Docker library, Docker archive library has recently changed to actually be much slower, and use a lot more memory and CPU. And so we're going to be working around that by having it switched to using the OCI archive instead, which didn't have that. And as I mentioned, there's a libsubid bug that we're going to get fixed. So this should be hopefully in a week or two. And that's what, there's also plans for 150. Okay, so looks like we were going to have it, so it can build directly from a Docker file, build a Apptainer container from a Docker file. Basically, it just calls out to the build library, the same ones that's used by Podman, the whole ecosystem. They can build those from Docker file, but then we immediately create it. Just to make it simpler so people don't have to run two different tools and run them. This just makes it all in one step. And also, someone asked for reproducibility, the ability to be able to find out what the initial OCI image hash was when you look back later. I said, I want to rebuild the same version of the previous of this container that was pulled down when we were just looking at latest, for example. Also, there's been a contribution from Intel for to be able to support imports for this AI-specific accelerator. It's called Gaudi, and it's called an HPU. So there'll be another option to pull those in, like within NVIDIA, like with the GPUs, and a no env option, so you can list certain environment variables to not import. There's some system administrators that wanted to be able to be finding things like Python path and things were interfering from the host into the container, so we want to be able to they want to be able to set an option to block certain environment variables, and add an option to make it simpler to build the data section. So there's commands you can run with Apptainer CIF, I think, to add a data section to your CIF file that you can use it gets automatically bind mounted in when you run your container, and that's kind of awkward to build. So this make it simpler and have the convenience function. And C groups v2. This is an unprivileged way you can put limits on your container. That works now with Apptainer, just not nested. And also, someone found an issue with resolve.conf. Like with they switch networks in the middle of if you're on a laptop and you move from wired to Wi-Fi or something like that, that changes, or if you switch to select a new Wi-Fi, that gives a different DNS lookups. That this will enable you to be able to survive that change. And also, Charlie Cloud has this a new way of building using seccomp, that way unprivileged, and probably we're looking into using that as another. There's certain limitations with the current unprivileged fake root command-based Apptainer build. And also, a possibility, I have this simple Apptainer attach bash script, which enables you to, you have an existing Apptainer command running, you can also attach to that, give it a process ID, and it can give you another shell or another command in the same process space. So I'm thinking about adding that as a separate command as part of the package. So that's all I have. If people have questions.
Yeah, Dev, I have one question. For the initial setup of Apptainer on the system, from the source specifically, if I want to install it still require the root permission, right, for the very initial setup from the root. Is there any plan to make that as well from the user's perspective?
Well, if you want to install it in a shared system directory, is the only reason why you need that. Or if you're using the mconfig, was it enable set UID or allow set UID? Are you using that option? No, because so then you should be able to. You don't have to run root to do the install, as long as you have write access to the directories. Yeah. So, any other questions? Or any kind of general discussion, because we had on the schedule earlier to say, we had a 20-minute time for discussion, but that's instead we expanded to another talk, so that's been taken up.
So from the user perspective, can you suggest some good best practices with respect to the Apptainer? As a developer point of view, what you suggest?
Let's see, best practices for the users. That's what you're asking for. I don't know. We haven't really collated one of the issues that we've seen is people trying to build the containers on multiple nodes, or pull them from a registry and multiple nodes. They say, no, that's a very bad practice. But we haven't really put together, right, here's the best practices for users. I don't think we have pulled those together, but certainly you can run into cases where people have been doing some things that were not good for performance, and that's one of them. People try to, no, please just pull it once, share it amongst all your nodes. Useful to have a user aspect. Yeah. Anybody have any other issues you want to bring? We got about 5 minutes, so the next talk officially starts.
Thanks. We heard earlier a little bit about some questions around portability to different systems with maybe a different MPI or a different network or something like that. I was wondering if you have the ability to summarize how far you could take one container, and at what point you just know that you're going to have to make a new image in order for it to run. And here I'm really curious about things like, what if it's, Intel MPI versus MPitch, and what if it's Slingshot versus InfiniBand, or, something running completely locally? Yeah,
I think we don't have very many assists for those things other than the NVIDIA, right? The NVIDIA one pulls in the libraries from the host. And I can tell you that there's a limitation with that. I think Dave Godlove briefly referenced it, but that there are still limitations where if he was talking about glibc incompatibilities, that does happen, especially if you're going from a newer host to an older operating system. So if the container has an older operating system in it, a lot of times the NVIDIA libraries from the host, they want a newer glibc than in the container. So that is a limitation. And generally, we just have for documentation for things like MPI says just shows you how to build this into your container. So yeah, that doesn't go between the different hosts. Now maybe some of the other packages in this that's talked about in the conference, like the HPC toolkit, which is supposed to be able to work with multiple different types of hardware. I don't know if that means the same installation can work with it, if it's the same binary, or if you have to select different versions that compile for different things. But yeah, that's not something that we've been able to provide that much assistance with. Yeah. But yeah, the NVIDIA option is really nice if you have compatible enough containers and hosts, but otherwise you don't have to build. You have to build them all into all the containers. But yeah.
So I think you're saying it may work in some situations, but
Yeah.
there's not a lot of help for sort
No.
of general strategy.
Yeah. No, I would think it wouldn't be part of the Apptainer's layer. Maybe you can find another software layer that is able to handle like HPC toolkit or something like that. Something that's specifically designed for being able to work on lots of different systems. Yeah, you can put that in your container.
Yeah, following up on the previous discussion, and this is not a question, more of a general note, that one of the use cases that I found for containerization was, let's say I built a container on Summit, but then I cannot share the image with somebody who is running a workload on Pleiades, which is NASA's computer, or running on Aurora. So I think the advantage that I do see container in production from an application perspective is being able to build image on one machine and port it on the other, but that is still a challenge, right? Yeah.
Yeah, maybe you can make a definition file that works on all of them. You can build it and from at least all the steps to make it to, but you might want to build it specifically for that system. I think that's something in the HTC world we don't worry about too much, because we just say, okay, we just say everybody has we're going to use the least common denominator in all the machines, but it's something that when we're told, okay, you also have allocations on these various HPCs, and we have to deal with all that too. Yeah.